earlier this afternoon, I took a look at your website and was very pleased. I haven't seen anything about the society for a long time, but this reminded me of how close in spirit, really, the Theosophical Association is to the kind of work that I've been doing for a long time. And I think when we get to the end of this, you'll agree that the stuff that I'm going to tell you about really fits very well with the overall aspirations of the society. Now, despite that friendly introduction by John, I want to tell you a little bit about my own career, how it began and got me into this work that I'm going to tell you about. I was a graduate student in psychology at Harvard. This is in the late 1960s, working on my dissertation, which had to do, by the way, with trying to get computers to understand the rudiments of word meaning from typewritten text to distinguish the main meanings of high frequency words in English. And I had gotten to a place in that work where I became convinced, contrary to my expectations going in, that no computer would ever understand the difference between metaphorical truth and literal falsehood. And this was a big disappointment to me. At that time, behaviorism was finally giving up the ghost after about 50 years of dominating American psychology. The computational of the theory of the mind was taking hold, and I was a very firm devotee of that outlook. I mean, it was certainly a big improvement on what preceded it, and I had high hopes that this was going to be kind of the pathway forward. So to get to this place in my own work was quite disturbing, really. And I mean, this was to be my career path, and suddenly it seemed to be kind of closing before my eyes. Anyway, right about that time, I got a call from my mother who wanted to tell me about my only sibling, an older sister, who it turned out had just become a medium. Now, it was clear to me right away that the reason why my mother was calling me was that she was a little nervous about this and figured that since I was a graduate student in psychology, I'd know all about it and could reassure her perhaps about the health of my sister. Well, I didn't know I had no idea what she was talking about really at the time. So I had to go over to the library and look the stuff up. And when I did, I discovered to my amazement that William James, who was one of my great intellectual heroes, had spent a large part of his adult life studying this subject. There were whole shelves full of books, and not only that, but shelves full of books of experimental studies of what we now call psi phenomena, that is paranormal things like extrasensory perception, including stuff like clairvoyance, telepathy, precognition, and mind over matter effects or psychokinesis. Anyway, so I mechanically polished off my dissertation, but meanwhile started reading extensively in the background on this stuff. And as I got deeper into it, I became convinced, almost convinced that, well, it looked like these phenomena are for real. And I certainly recognized right away that they deeply challenged the kind of views that I had grown up with, basically, which, well, it's really kind of the received wisdom of most elite opinion in societies worldwide right now, which is a doctrine called physicalism, which is kind of a purified philosophical descendant of what used to be called materialism in preceding centuries. Anyway, that struck me as important, and so I started corresponding with J.B. Rhine down in Durham, North Carolina. And to make a long story short, I ended up going down there to sign up for one of his 6-month, $400 a month trial periods. And I had been there not more than a month when I encountered a guy who was one of the best subjects ever to come into a parapsychology laboratory. He could do basically anything we asked him to. and ultimately did a long series of experiments with us, taking a leave of absence from Yale Law School in order to do that. So at this point, I mean, he really removed whatever residual doubts I had as to the reality of the basic psi phenomena. Psi is the generic term for the whole family. And so I began pursuing my own ways of looking into things. I got interested in trying to study physiological correlates of success in controlled psi experiments. And J.B. Rhine was not interested in that, so I moved over to the School of Engineering at Duke, where there was already a group headed in that direction. And to make a long story short, I spent about the next 12 years or so working in that direction, and became convinced during that time that this is a productive path. In fact, just getting back to it now. I then had to take a long detour in the middle of my career. I did a bunch of conventional neuroscience at UNC-Chapel Hill, having to do with somatosensory cortex in humans, the part of us, our brains that deal with things like touch, pain, hot and cold, that sort of stuff. And while it had its subtle joys, I was always looking for an opportunity to get back into psychical research, which always seemed to me far more important in a, big picture kind of way. So it was about 1993, I got together with Emily Williams, who was one of Ian Stevenson's research helpers at the University of Virginia. Ian, you probably know, is the main architect of work on what we call rebirth cases, or court cases of the reincarnation type, involving small children who begin speaking and acting as though they're actually remembering things from a previous life that you can go and investigate whether they actually know things they couldn't have learned in any normal way. And Ian published a bunch of books and hundreds of papers on that and related subjects. Anyway, so Emily and I got together, having these shared interests, and in 1998, we were invited to a conference at Esalen Institute out in Big Sur, California. Now, the way this had come about was that Mike Murphy is the co-founder of Esalen, and who is the main architect of what he calls the Center for Theory and Research. It's kind of a little think tank embedded within Esalen. I mean, if you know about Esalen, you know lots of pretty wild stuff has gone on out there over the years, but there's a very serious side to it also, which is Mike's think tank. And under auspices of CTR, Center for Theory and Research, he's convened a large number of working groups devoted to subjects of interest to him and things of that sort, very, very versed in all of these historical traditions, and just a tremendous intellectual, very much in the spirit of the original Society for Psychical Research in England. Man of enormous ability. Anyway, he saw very clearly that the prevailing wisdom about the nature of things is incompatible with post-mortem survival. And he also knew that there were people studying this subject in various ways around the country and around the world, actually. And so he convened one of these working groups to discuss that evidence. So let me now kind of fill in a bit more of the background here. I've alluded repeatedly to this prevailing doctrine. Let me say a little more specifically what it involves. I mean, it's the stuff that we have all grown up with from elementary school on. It's a picture in which reality consists ultimately at bottom of little bits of solid stuff zipping around in fields of force governed by mechanical laws, and everything else that exists has to be manufactured somehow out of that basic stuff. So for example, in particular, we and all other animals are just extremely complicated biochemical machines. We explain things about us. We are to explain things about us, including everything about mind and consciousness, by reducing it somehow to lower level stuff. Hopefully, in the end, that lowest level stuff. That's the kind of program of physicalism. Clearly, if that picture is true, there can't be any post-mortem survival, period. Mind and consciousness are manufactured by physiological processes in our brains. When the brain is gone, mind and consciousness are gone. It has to be that way. Well, Mike Murphy recognized that, yes, if that's true, then we're out of luck and there can't be survival, and yet here's all this evidence, so let's talk about it. And so we did. We started in 1998, began by presenting, not all of it by any means, but a good chunk of the existing evidence. And it soon became clear that we are really all anti-physicalist. And we decided that what we needed to do was to take the whole subject on in two stages, overlapping stages, really. The first would be to try to assemble in one place a lot of the kinds of evidence that we believe falsifies conventional physicalism. Now, the way we set out to do that was to revisit an extraordinary book that was published in 1903 called Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. It was written by F.W.H. Myers, who was one of the founders of the SPR in England. That was an extraordinary organization, by the way, for anybody who doesn't know about it already. Some of the cream of British intelligentsia of that period, this is 1882 when it was formed, subsequently joined by people like William James from the United States. And it was an extraordinary amalgamation of human talent. And Myers was one of the chief architects of the whole research program there. And he wrote this book, 2 volumes, 1,400 pages altogether, in which he attempted to do the same sort of thing that we were now going to try to replicate and expand. That is, he became convinced that physicalism or materialism at that time was false. He was also especially interested in survival and became convinced from his own research that it was a reality. So we put this book together to outline a theory of human personality and to review a number of these kinds of evidence. So our goal was to kind of revisit a lot of these topics in light of the subsequent 100+ years of biomedical research, and to reevaluate his theory and his views about all of these subjects. Now, we did this, we started actually in the year 2000. That was when we hatched this plan, with the expectation that we would get this book done in time for the centennial of Myers's publication in 1903. But we didn't actually finish writing the thing until about 2006, and it didn't come out until 2007. But you'll see why. This is the book, first book. Yeah, it's a big fat thing, 800 pages. And I think we succeeded in doing what we set out to do. And let me say a little bit more about this. What we know, everybody agrees that there are normally strong correlations between mind stuff and brain stuff. We know, for example, that if you get hit hard enough on the head, or ingest too much alcohol or a psychedelic substance, or have an invasive tumor growing in your brain, that these things can have effects on your mental life. So there's no doubt that physical things can cause mental things. But what about the other direction? Now, let's say I decide I want to raise my right arm and the thing goes up in the air. That looks like mental causation, wouldn't you agree? Well, says the physicalist, no, you see, you've misunderstood what's really going on here, because that intention, that idea that you had, is really nothing more than a neuroelectric process going on in your brain, a physical thing, and that's what caused your arm to go up. No problem. Now, that's a very tough argument to get around, mainly because we know so little about the physical side. But one way you can get around it is to find things that you can be sure or almost sure an unaided brain could not possibly do. Now, this is, for one thing, where these psi phenomena come in, because virtually everybody agrees that they can't be accounted for by any normal physical process. I mean, that's what makes them interesting to people like me and what makes them anathema to so many mainstream scientists. In the book and here, I won't talk about it much. I will just tell you that the literature of parapsychology now includes thousands of case reports of spontaneous psi events in everyday life, thousands of reports of experimental studies, a substantial proportion of which are independently significant. I personally do not think that any open-minded person who takes the trouble to study this evidence can come away doubting that these phenomena are real. The basic phenomena occur, period. You can take that to the bank. And our science is going to have to grow in some way in order to accommodate that fact. Now, like most people coming into the subject from the scientific side, I have to say, I mean, I was a physicalist myself as a graduate student. It was just like part of the atmosphere. You absorbed it passively. It's not that we talked about it and argued about the subject. It's just what everybody believed. And you figured, well, they must know. So you do too. I mean, that's kind of how most of us work, philosophically speaking, I think. But I really hoped that some small change somewhere in that grand scheme of things would allow us to accommodate these psi phenomena. And let me say, kind of by way of preview of what I'm going to expand on now, the whole history of my later dealings with the subject has been to drive me away from that comfortable position and toward the view that not only do we have to modify our basic worldview in some basic way, I have come to the view that we have to modify it in a really radical way that converts it practically into its exact opposite, meaning some kind of idealism, which is the philosophical opposite of physicalism, in which the mental becomes the driver of everything. But we'll get back to that. Anyway, before I leave the parapsychology world, though, let me mention one other important point about it. There's the evidence for survival. Now, this is a really complicated subject. You wouldn't believe how much literature there is. I've never really tried to count them, but I would guess there's hundreds of thousands of pages of really serious reports by very able people taking one or the other side of this discussion. And people who know this evidence have come down on both sides of the subject, usually just barely, kind of. And everybody recognizes that there are only two viable, possibly viable ways of explaining it. One is in terms of unusual kinds of psi abilities in living persons, living agent psi, as we call it now, LAP, or survival itself. And while this discussion is extremely arcane and technical and difficult, the point here is that either horn of this dilemma is fatal to physicalism. It can't handle either side of that discussion. So the outcome of that debate will not impact the kind of things that I'm bringing to you now. And of course, I mean, one of the most mainstream scientists just ignore the subject. I mean, that's partly understandable. You know, people are busy, they have their own work to do and don't want to get involved in some complicated thing that looks to most of them so unpromising to begin with anyhow. And most of the critical stuff comes from a small cadre of kind of professional psi deniers who live off attempts to deny the reality of the phenomena. But as I say, I think we have to take home the understanding that these things are real and we're going to have to come to grips with them scientifically somehow. Now, people who hate parapsychology often try to, treat it like some sort of, a little disease off in a corner somewhere to isolate and quarantine the subject as though they're being triumphant down the line except for that, and they can just kind of ignore this one little problem. But that is not the case. There are other things about human psychophysical capacities that are also extremely hard to explain in physicalist terms, and our book contains chapters about most of these. I mean, it contains other things as well, but I'm going to just tell you about some of the highlights of Irreducible Mind. There's a big chapter in there about memory. It's probably the hardest chapter in the book, in which a British psychologist named Alan Gauld, who's also a great student of the psychical research literature, he spent his life studying this subject, and he puts together a bunch of reasons why he doesn't believe that physicalism can explain all the everyday properties of human memory. I'm not going to try to replicate that discussion. There are other parts that are kind of closer to the home territory. The next one in particular, chapter 5, Irreducible Mind, is about psychological automatisms and secondary centers of consciousness. Secondary centers correspond to things like multiple personalities, or multiple personality disorder, or dissociative identity disorder, as it's now called, in which there appear to be more than one personality associated with a single organism. And not only that, but the normally hidden personality, the alters, can sometimes be far greater in capacity than the everyday personality itself. It can be very different in startling ways, for example, in having different allergies or requiring different eyeglass prescriptions in order to be able to read. And worst of all, there are, in some of these cases, very well documented, particularly around the beginning of the 20th century, end of 19th, cases in which, say, personality B is inclusive of personality A, in the sense that B knows most or all of what's going on in A's conscious life, but not vice versa. And these kinds of observations conflict profoundly, in a way we explain in that chapter, with the prevailing picture of how personality and cognitive systems are organized in relation to the brain. Those kinds of things just could not happen if that picture is correct. That's another pretty complicated subject. That's a good chapter by Adam Crabtree, who's a real expert in that area. The next chapter involves Emily and myself and Bruce Grayson, who is the person at DOPS most involved in research on near-death experiences. In fact, let me mention in passing, Bruce just published a book called After. It's got a long subtitle about a physician explains what near-death experiences tell us about life and a possible afterlife, or something to that effect. It's very good, just came out. And what I want to talk about particularly is one specific category of those experiences that, to my mind, is emerging as possibly the most crucial piece of evidence against conventional physicalism. And it's this: there's a sizable proportion of these cases that occur under conditions such as deep general anesthesia and or cardiac arrest, in which the physiological conditions that most contemporary neuroscientists believe are necessary for any conscious experience have been abolished, or at minimum very severely degraded. Nonetheless, people are not only having experiences, but some of them are having the most intense and transformative experience of their entire life. And what this shows, I think most clearly, and I have two other categories of phenomena I'm going to say a little bit about, but this one really makes this point most clearly, I think. What these kinds of observations do is to support an alternative way of understanding the brain-mind connection. That is, instead of brains manufacturing mind and consciousness, what they do is they condition the operation of a mind and consciousness that are functionally and perhaps ontologically distinctive from the brain itself. That is, there can be mental activity in the absence of a normally functioning brain. How do we know that's true? Well, because in some of the best cases, people report things that happened during the period of apparent unconsciousness that can be verified. Sometimes things that even happen at a distance or where there's a blockage in place. For example, a patient undergoing surgery may have her eyes blindfolded, and yet she reports some kind of visual experience. And it may be a visual experience of something that actually happened down the hall 10 doors away. And there are plenty of sort of details to be discussed in regard to these cases, but I think they clearly establish that minds can function in the absence of a normally functioning brain. And this upholds this alternative view, which was first formalized, by the way, by William James in his Ingersoll lecture of 1897 on two supposed objections to the doctrine of immortality. He pointed out there that even though we normally think of functional dependence, which is, mind-brain correlation, basically, in terms of causation, that's not the only possibility, and that this other possibility that I mentioned is still in play, and in some ways looks superior to the regular view in that it can potentially explain other things in addition to the normal correlations, like, for example, psi phenomena. And James and Myers themselves brought that out in considerable detail. The other two main empirical topics in Irreducible Mind are genius, basically, very high level creativity, and mystical experiences. And both of these are subjects that are very poorly handled in contemporary psychology, cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience. Less so for creativity. There's a quite big literature on creativity, but I have to say that most of it is just kind of wading around in the shallows of the subject. So when you look at really extreme cases, like, for example, that of the Indian mathematician Ramanujan, you find things going on that absolutely beggar the conceptual apparatus that's available to psychology today. And furthermore, people go into these states, there's a lot of automatism and that sort of thing, sometimes access to hidden higher level personalities, and all of that stuff is going on in that literature and not well handled in contemporary psychology. And the situation, if anything, is far worse in regard to mystical experience. And mystical experience, I have come to believe, well, let me say first, in terms of mainstream psychology and neuroscience, the subject has been routinely abused by scientists ever since William James's time. James took it very seriously. If you remember, in the varieties of religious experience, there's a chapter on mysticism, which he specifically describes as the chapter from which all other chapters derive their light. For him, it was the center of the subject. And I should also mention that it's rarely noticed now that James specifically acknowledges in the book that he is using F.W.H. Myers's model of human personality as the basis for his discussion of all of these religious phenomena. In any case, hardly anybody talked about it at all during the behaviorist era, which extended from 1913, when J.B. Watson published his manifesto, till at least the mid-1960s, when I was a graduate student. And even since that time, the relatively few mentions of the subject in the scientific literature have been typically dismissive and, if anything, pathologizing of the whole business. And I think that's a fundamental mistake. And one of my hopes for our books is that they will engender a higher level of interest among more scientists in the scientific study of mystical experience, because I think those kinds of experiences really open windows into the deeper parts of reality that we have to take account of in framing our metaphysical picture or worldview or conceptual framework, or whatever we want to call it. Okay, so that is a summary of the main contents of Irreducible Mind. I think, as I said earlier, that we really did establish a pretty formidable set of arguments against physicalism. And that's all to the good. I think it's long past its sell-by date. But now comes the really hard part. I mean, Irreducible Mind, as big as it is mainly a kind of giant clerical task of finding all this scattered literature. I left out, unfortunately, one big subject, which is extreme psychophysical influence, which my wife wrote. And it describes a number of phenomena, like things like hypnotically induced blisters, sometimes of geometric shape, like Janet would touch a patient with a little cruciform poker of some kind. It was cool, of course, telling the patient that it's red hot and I'm going to touch you with it. And lo and behold, a cruciform blister arises on the patient's forearm. Well, we know how a hot poker would cause that to happen, but how it's done from the inside, so to speak, no one has the slightest idea. And there's a whole batch of related phenomena in that chapter about those things. So that's another category of unexplainable phenomena. Okay, but as I said, now comes the hard part, which is to try to figure out in what different way the world must be organized in order that these kinds of phenomena can happen. And again, we spent several years kind of beating around the base of that mountain, trying to just figure out a path forward. Yeah, we were limited somewhat by the specific expertise that we had on board in terms of who knew what about what subjects. But what we did was to try to identify a whole bunch of conceptual frameworks, both ancient and modern, that were formulated with or in light of an appreciation that some or all of these paranormal kinds of phenomena do actually exist. Just taking that for granted and trying to put forth a picture of the world. And what that resulted in, once we got started on that path, we recruited some new people. And that eventuated in 2015 in this book, Beyond Physicalism. Also by Roman and Littlefield. It's somewhat smaller, but it's plenty packed. We had in there, in particular, there were 3 chapters by physicists, 2 quantum theorists, and a more of a cosmologist and string theory relativity guy. That's Bernard Carr, who was recently the president of the SPR. He's ex-president now. And he has one a hyperdimensional theory and attempts to fit a lot of psi phenomena and other things into that picture. The main quantum theorist was a man named Henry Stapp, who's one of the principal architects of modern quantum theory and S-matrix theory, which is one of its main sort of calculation technologies. And for years, he's been developing a model in which allows for mind-brain interaction, a kind of dualism, which doesn't violate any conservation principles or anything like that. He's written about it extensively. And his chapter in Beyond Physicalism gives an explanation of that and basically shows how it could be applied to explain most of the phenomena that we talk about in Irreducible Mind, including postmortem survival. He has no difficulty imagining that as a possibility consistent with his theory, and says it's up to you guys to evaluate the evidence. Quantum theory permits it, so there you are. The third was by a man named Harold Atmanspacher. He's a quantum theorist, and he's been working for years on the Jung-Pauli dialogue, which is enormous, and deriving from that a kind of dual aspect monism, a different approach to brain-mind interaction. Then we had several chapters representing traditional mystically inspired religio-philosophic systems. So, for example, there's a wonderful chapter on Neoplatonism. We have one on Patanjali and yoga. I actually wrote that with the help of Ian Witcher, who's a Patanjali specialist. And let's see, there's one on Abhinava Gupta and Kashmiri Shaivism by Lorelei Biernacki. Then there are several sort of modern or semi-modern Western philosophical systems as well. There's a chapter, for example, by Paul Marshall, who's in the UK. It's a kind of modified Leibnizian monadology. And I can't possibly go into the details of it, but he modifies it in a way that brings it much closer to the Myers-James picture of personality in being able to account for things like higher states and psi and genius and so on, and which he thinks is also quite compatible with contemporary developments in physics, in particular quantum theory and relativity. And before I leave that, let me just mention that, I mean, I'm talking mainly in terms of things in my world, psychological capacities, but it's also true that I mean, physicalism is a doctrine that's anchored strictly in the classical physics of the late 19th century. And physics has come a long way since then, to the extent that physicalism, which started out as being, a philosophical theory anchored in physics, is no longer compatible with leading edge developments in physics. In fact, it's trailing edge physics. Furthermore, there's been a lot of recent discussion in the world of philosophy of mind, which has convinced many philosophers that not only can we not presently provide a physicalist account of consciousness, we're never going to be able to. So we're not the only people who are pressing in this direction. We're just doing it from a more specifically psychological and empirical direction. Anyway, getting back to beyond physicalism, there's also there's a big chapter on a kind of modified Whiteheadian metaphysics by Eric Weiss, which also purports to keep the important property of Whitehead's system that it appears to be compatible with quantum theory and relativity, while adding or modifying it in such a way as to allow it to explain some additional things that some Whiteheadians have thought it can't, notably precognition. That's a kind of long side story. But so Eric thinks he has an improved version of Whitehead that can do the job we need. Adam Crabtree wrote a chap about Charles Sanders Peirce, who was one of James's contemporaries at Harvard, and who developed a metaphysical system that he believed was capable of explaining everything, including paranormal phenomena and survival, all of which he took seriously, like James. Then one of the things I should mention, because it has repercussions for you, I think, there's a chapter 4 in this book by a guy named David Presti and myself. David Presti is a neurobiologist from Berkeley. And in this chapter, we attempted to kind of review what's known, what little is known, I should say, about the psychobiological things that accompany various targeted phenomena, including genius, the psi phenomena, and mystical experience. And we were led to a picture in which we thought we could begin to identify what aspects of brain activity may be most closely associated with the intrusion of these kinds of phenomena into everyday consciousness. And the big point here is really that this model, the psychological model of the more of William James, or the subliminal self of F.W.H. Myers, is that certain conditions in the organism, and particularly the brain, will permit this stuff to emerge into everyday conscious life. Normally it's kind of hidden, and in that sense unconscious, only because the everyday personality is not aware of it. I mean, this is not something you hear about in most psychology courses. William James described it as an entirely unsuspected peculiarity in the constitution of human beings. And Myers's work really went to the establishment of the reality of this kind of phenomenon. And James then takes it later on, not only in Varieties of Religious Experience, but also his last book, A Pluralistic Universe, and generalizes it basically into a picture of the reality as a whole. And we'll get to that in a moment. Yeah, David and I had identified this particular system. It's interesting that it's called the default mode network, and it's kind of neurophysiological embodiment of the everyday ego or personality, consciousness. And it's now known from recent neuroimaging studies with psychedelics that the operation of this system is systematically dismantled by those substances. So we're increasingly of the opinion that this is where to look for ways of, I mean, it's a consequence of our basic picture that we ought to be able to find ways, we ought to be able to find out about things that go on in the brain that permit expression of these kinds of normally latent human potentials. And if we learn enough and they're the right kinds of things, there ought to be possibilities for developing new technologies that would permit more people to access those potentialities. And I think everybody who's looked into this subject agrees that that would be a good thing for us individually and collectively. I mean, a good example is in the near-death experiences, for example. People who have these things, they're very often transformative in a positive way. That is, people become more loving, more altruistic, less, preoccupied with egoistic concerns, less afraid of death. There's a whole litany of positive changes that occur. And it's the same for the little we know about mystical experiences. People who, you could say really that a near-death experience is a mystical experience had under less than optimal circumstances where you almost died. That's basically what it comes down to. All right, so there again, now we've got, I think there were a dozen of them all together. And the question is, I mean, are they similar? And the basic answer is that yes, they are. We haven't canvassed all the things that are out there by any means. They are generically similar. And as James already remarked in his mysticism chapter from Varieties of Religious Experience, they tend in a specific philosophical direction, which is towards some kind of idealism. And more specifically, we argued in the chapter 14th, I argued in chapter 14 of Beyond Physicalism, that direction is what is known in the theological world as panentheism. This is a kind of tertium quid relative to the two historically primary positions, which are either theism, in which there's a God who creates everything, and then it goes on whether he has anything more to do with it or not. The other type is pantheism, in which God is essentially identified with the world as it is. Panentheism, and they come in many historical forms, it's a family of related positions, not a single well-defined position. God bears the same kind of relation to the world as a whole that we individuals bear to our brains and bodies. That is, he's in the world, in all of it, and yet there's something left over outside. A absolutely great book that discusses this subject is by Hartshorne and Rees. And Hartshorne was one of the big Whiteheadians, so there's a lot of that in there, but they take about 50 historical thinkers, present some of their views, and then comment on them in relation to the central doctrine. So that's where we think things are generally headed. Now, I should say there has been a third stage, which resulted just last month in this, the third book in this series. This is called Consciousness Unbound. Subtitle is Liberating Mind from the Tyranny of Materialism, and you can be sure that was deliberately intended as a kind of thumb in the eye of the opposition, stir up some controversy maybe. I mean, our biggest problem is that these mainstream people mainly ignore us. You know, they go on about their business and just don't want to hear anything about anything different from what they already believe. It continues both both main themes of the two previous books. We got a first section, which consists of kind of state-of-the-art reports on some big areas of psychical research. So there's a chapter by Bruce Grayson on near-death experiences, one by Jim Tucker on the cases of the reincarnation type, and a really excellent chapter on precognition by our friend Bob Rosenberg, is one of the members of our Esalen group. Then we have, in part two, we've got 5 new contenders, theories mostly very closely related to the ones we canvassed in Beyond Physicalism, but some of these come from new characters who've never stuck their necks out before in the context of psychical research. For example, Max Velmans is a very prominent guy in consciousness research. He has a kind of dual aspect monist perspective that he develops in detail. We've got a historical one from a Hegel scholar who shows that Hegel is very much in the thick of these kinds of pictures. One from a Jungian showing that Jung, toward the end of his career, was actually moving in what amounts to an evolutionary panentheist direction. He justifies that by close analysis of some of Jung's late works. Then there are a couple of new ones that are, I think, of maybe even particular interest. One by a man named Bernardo Kastrup, who's a computer engineer by training, had a series of mystical experiences himself, and as a result has kind of abandoned his engineering upbringing and has been basically an independent scholar writing tracts about metaphysics, idealist metaphysics, while doing more of his engineering as a day job, kind of on the side. And one finally from a man named Federico Fagin, a very interesting guy. This is one of the major pioneers of the microelectronics industry. Has recently published a book called Silicon, in fact, that relates a lot of that early history of microelectronics. He's responsible for the central technologies that made the whole thing work. Well, it turned out that in midlife, at about age 40, he started having mystical experiences. He's a physicist by training. These quickly convinced him that there was something fundamentally wrong with physics as he had learned it, and was going to have to be expanded in ways that would allow it to account for the kind of thing he was experiencing. So he has his own version of a kind of idealist model in this book, and he is rapidly developing that even beyond the publication of this. He's got a paper in press that goes much further in terms of the theory, and he's even hooked up with a quantum theorist in Italy who was thinking along very similar lines. So here again is an idealist theory that seems grounded in physics and yet has the potential to explain a lot of the phenomena that we originally cataloged in Irreducible Mind. And let me say just one more thing about this, and then I guess we're probably about to the end. I would have to say that when I started down this long path, idealism was absolutely the furthest thing from my mind. It always seemed totally implausible to me. And even now, it seems that way to most mainstream people. In fact, if you ask any physicalist, get talking with them about this, they may acknowledge that they're having difficulty explaining consciousness, yes, but you get the usual sort of promissory materialism that, well, you know, we've been here before and eventually we'll get it right. But usually they're candid enough to say, yeah, these are really hard problems. But then they go on to say, well, but you know, you have exactly the opposite problem because you can't explain matter in terms of mind or consciousness. And for a long time, that seemed to me, yeah, that's right. But I belatedly came to appreciate that it is not right. And I want to explain why. There is a subtle but crucial asymmetry between these two explanatory challenges. When we say to the physicalist, you're having trouble explaining consciousness in physicalist terms, it's very clear what we're talking about. Their idea is, atoms and subatomic particles and all that somehow ultimately through physiological processes give rise to mind and consciousness. And nobody can explain that. Nobody really has the slightest idea how to explain that. And many people no longer think it's possible. But when the physicalist challenges an idealist to explain matter, that's not the proper challenge. Matter is a concept that we developed over centuries to explain large parts of our experience. And it worked very well for that purpose up until the end of the 19th century. But matter, as classically conceived, no longer exists, period. And what the idealist really has to explain is the regularities of experience that the concept of matter was invented to explain. Now, I know that's a very terse statement. I hope it gets through to the audience. I talk about it actually in the introduction to Consciousness Unbound. So, what does it all add up to? Well, there's an epilogue in Consciousness Unbound also. And the basic point of it is really this. Everybody recognizes that our world is absolutely a mess right now. And I personally think, and a lot of other people think, that a lot of that can be traced either directly or indirectly to this prevailing physicalism, which lends itself to, objectification of everything and exploitation of everything for short-term commercial gain and all the rest of it. We really need a better worldview conducive to better individual and collective human behavior. And I personally think that we're in kind of a race condition to see if we're going to be able to save the planet. Because if we keep going down the path we're on right now, I think there's no doubt we're going to destroy ourselves before much longer. We got one of several ways of accomplishing that. So I think that this theoretical work that we've done is headed in that better direction. And the epilogue makes an appeal for that point of view, but also points out at the end that even if, we have a better worldview and consensus about it, that certainly doesn't guarantee by itself that it will be applied effectively and with any of its own potential bad consequences sufficiently under control. But at least I have hope that we're on a path that can be not only, intellectually gratifying and help us scientifically, but might have something useful to do with the state of the world. And in conclusion, I just say I think a lot of that, if it happens, will be manifest through how individual people take it and incorporate it into their lives, and maybe, with any luck, learn how to access some of these higher capabilities that I think we probably all have, or many of us have, that we normally can't access. And let's hope that it ends up having some positive impact on the world situation. It's what the Theosophical Association was set up to do way back when. Eh?